Okay, Henry Hobson Richardson. He was 18 years older than Louis Sullivan. So out of the three architects that I mentioned, he was the oldest. This makes him even more somehow, precious. Henry Hobson Richardson, 1838, 1886. He died rather young at 47 towards 48. And he could have lived longer, but nevertheless he built a lot, and you are going to see. So Henry Hobson Richardson, born on September 29th, but he died on April 27th, and that's the reason why we talk about him today. In 1886, was a prominent American architect, best known for his work in a style that became known as Richardsonian Romanesque. Along with Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, Richardson is one of the, I quote, the recognized trinity of American architecture. Trinity, of course, has religious connotations. So this shows, the high stature in the pantheon of American architects. Anyway, Romanesque architecture. Romanesque architecture preceded the Gothic, and it is characterized by a solidity, rigidity, and these are virtues which I think might be relevant for us as well, since for the past a certain number of years, architecture became rather fragile because of deconstruction and because of all kinds of experiments. So, but the Romanesque is not an architecture that is devoid of sensibility. And actually, I thought, but I couldn't prepare it for today, to also show Romanesque architecture, because there are beautiful examples of a major architecture that was built before the Middle Ages, before the Gothic times. This was the man. He had an illness. He was a very voluminous man. I love this picture of him, with a hood above his head, kind of like a monk, and very romantic. I love Richardson. I think it is very unfortunate that he lived only for 47 years. But you will see, he left. He had a powerful impact on North American architecture. A determined man, obviously, if you look at his face, and unconventional, artistic, powerful, kind of like Balzac. I like Richardson. He was perhaps not as innovative as Frank Lloyd Wright and maybe even as Sullivan, but let's consider also that he was the oldest. So, he was a little bit more removed from what we call modernity than the other two. So we begin with this very important work by him. In fact, so important that Tafuri and Francesco Dalco placed an image of this church on the cover of the volume on modern architecture, which is part of those 18 volumes that Pierluigi Nervi sponsored in a way, or even initiated the publication of the largest body of work on the history of architecture that I know of. So I will, at the beginning, I will just show some works, and then we'll go in detail. Now, this building, of course, for the modernist, might not appear to be modern at all. We look at the building here on the left, and yes, it's a big distance. But this being said, we cannot ignore the aesthetics of the building. It's not as without innovation as we might think at first. The Thomas Crane Public Library in Quincy, Massachusetts. He built several public libraries with Japanese-inspired eyelid dormers in the roof on each side of the entrance. He used stone. He used stone a lot. And this in itself is some kind of a, novelty, so to speak. Because, in modernity, kind of got rid of the stone, but not him. The old Colony Station in North illustrates Richardson use of Japanese architectural concept. It's a railway station. We are going to review more in detail some of these buildings. A detail from this railroad station, a dragon carved in the beam of a glazed Syrian arch. Would anyone do something like this today? No. But maybe might not be totally nonsensical to return to some of these old practices. Maybe. Although built in traditional fashion of stone without steel frame, Richardson well-integrated Marshall Field wholesale store in Chicago was very influential in the development of modern approaches to building facades. Quite a large building, and impressive. It's like the architect himself. Is a building that you cannot ignore. Howard Taylor, aka Taylor Library Building in New Orleans. If you see a few buildings by him, it's kind of easy to imagine to imagine that other buildings that you look at without knowing that they are by him, there are certain stylistic elements, but all in all, there is power in his buildings. John Glessner House, Chicago, 1986. No, this is wrong. It cannot be 1986. Probably 1886. Sorry about this. Very different from Louis Sullivan and from Frank Lloyd Wright. This proud member of the Trinity of the North American architecture. Grange Sard House in Albany, an urban house. We are going to see also his own house, different from these houses that we saw already, and rather fragile by comparison. This is a mansion that unfortunately does not exist any longer. It was built in Great Britain, but if this building was still alive, I would have admired it in as much as I admire it in this postcard. It's Victorian architecture, but it has a robustness and thus a certain modernity that perhaps are influenced in a way by the vitality of the Brave New World. Cheney Building, 1905. I don't know if it still exists. Is this one? And a church. He built several churches. I think quite good. I mean, they are not Ronchamp, they are not Saint Pierre de Firminy Vert, but, and yes, maybe those stones are a little bit too, rebelliously showing their individuality in the fabric of the wall, but still is interesting, particularly because of this extensive use of stone. I love stone, and I wonder if we cannot bring stones back into our buildings, at least here and there. I am sure that if he lived longer, he would have produced, some surprising buildings, because I think he was capable of innovating. And again, he died at an age when Louis Kahn didn't even exist, so to speak. Kahn became famous around 855. Here we have Richardson building a lot until he was 47 when he died. And we didn't yet see too much of his work. You will see as we move forward with the presentation that he did a lot of things. 1866 house in Boston. There is no stone here. There is no primitive future here, so to speak. You might even pass by this house without stopping, because it's true. It's not, it's not strikingly original. But it's an urban building which has a certain dignity, and it's well built, and it's okay. Not every building has to be a so-called strikingly original. This is his own house in Staten Island in New York. Well, it was refurbished. I don't know if that's how he intended it when he built it, but we have a glimpse at his own house in Staten Island. So not in Massachusetts, but in Staten Island. I wonder what he did in Staten Island, because he lived in Massachusetts, so north of New York, and Staten Island is south of New York. Anyway, sorry about the resolution of these pictures. A luminous house, but I'm sure it was refurbished. Who knows? Maybe some changes of certain importance took place here. A monument in Washington, D.C. From 1868, Alexander Dallas Patch. It's, not very impressive perhaps, but in the 19th century, architects did address the problem, if I am to use the word problem, of Domus Eterna. So did Sullivan. In the case of Wright, I don't know actually if he worked for the dead, but Sullivan did, and when he worked together with Adler, and so did Richardson. And in Great Britain, of course, the Victorian architects did it a lot. Another house from 1868 in Buffalo, New York. This is the gentler side of Richardson. He's not using, walls that are, covered with stone. They are, civilized domestic buildings that do not try to show any kind of, misanthropy. The civil side of Richardson is shown here. And, he was an educated man. He was not, a primitive man. But Brattle Square Church, now the First Baptist Church in Boston, from 1869. You might say that this spire this tower is too tall, but it has personality, and even the building of the church per se, which is next to the tower, is hidden by the trees. But in this picture, I imagine, it's an urban presence which is not to be ignored or criticized. I think it adds something to the personality of the city. And the ivy loves to climb on these old walls, And you know, is that the prestige of the passage of time that is present here. It's incredible that he built so much in, you know, I mean, I don't know when he started, you know, maybe he built all these buildings and many others, which you are going to see, some of them at least, in less than 20 years. So this is in Boston, this church. Now the New York State Asylum in Buffalo, talking about asylums, we talked yesterday about the Black Lily of Peter Zumthor. I was asking myself, why did he call it the Black Lily, and what is the symbolism? You know, the lily comes in other colors. Why did he choose the black one? 1869, New York State Asylum. You know, it's called an asylum, but look at this. You know, it's like a palace in Buffalo. I mean, if such buildings were built somewhere in Europe, they would have been, you know, central to the culture of the city where they were built. But this one in Buffalo is just one of the buildings. I mean, the North America has some incredible buildings, which if they would have been planted in some other country or on some other continent, they would have been the glory of that place. And here, you know, these are just some buildings in Buffalo by Richardson. Uh, what you see in the center here is a contemporary intervention or proposal. This does not belong, of course, to H. Richardson. But they are, you know, I mean, by any standards, these are glorious buildings. Even if you don't have an interest in what we call tradition, we cannot deny the, you know, the richness, the complexity, the power, you know, yes, the force of this architecture. So he built everything, you know, from, you know, graves to houses, private residences, to large civic buildings like you see here. It is this masonry architecture, this architecture with the solid walls, you know, heavy. It is a heavy architecture. And somehow I miss that heavy architecture. It seems Richardson, he was not interested in a non-gravitational architecture. He didn't want his architecture to levitate. And my question is why? Why today there is an obsession, even an obsession, yes, with architecture on even less than two legs. I remember Wolf Prick saying that they got rid, meaning him and his partner, got rid of the fourth leg of a building or of buildings, of architecture in general, and they were on their way to get rid even of the third. So to have architecture on two legs, meaning, you know, a working architecture, a running architecture. And then, of course, the next step would be to get rid even of the second leg. But here we have H. Richardson, who didn't even think of something like this. And actually, this obsession with non-gravitational architecture is a very recent phenomenon, and I wonder why. You know, what is wrong with an architecture which does not want to fly? Like this. I mean, wasn't architecture supposed to be kind of a, you know, a place which comforts you exactly through its stability? And why are we interested in instability these days? when in fact our lives are more unstable than ever in a way because of the mobility with the car and with the information you know, assault on us. And there are various reasons why our lives are actually very unstable. Why would we need also our architecture to be unstable is a question I have. I wouldn't mind at all such an architecture. But it seems for some reason, perhaps we don't believe any longer in living on this earth. And that's why, of course, we think now of going to Mars and going to the moon and going who knows where. This is a courthouse in Springfield, Massachusetts from 1871. And he built, it's interesting, this man really worked for various programs, you know, courthouses, you know, asylums, you know, palace of justice, everything, libraries, churches. H. Richardson, maybe he had an intuition that he will not live forever or for too long, and then he gave himself completely into doing as much as possible in as quickly as possible. But I think he built well. And not all buildings are highly original, maybe, but even those which are not very so-called original, like this one, you cannot deny, and I'm sure the North Americans appreciate them. Another church from 1871 in Springfield, Massachusetts. I like this church. You know, it's not, again, it's not Ronchamp, it's not Saint-Pierre de Firminy-Vert, it's not the churches of Frank Lloyd Wright, but it does speak, this building, of eternity in a way, you know, and thus about God. And that's its raison d'etre, no? It's the house of God. This is what the church is. He uses historical references, but I don't think that he does it unskillfully or in an unconvincing manner. I think there is a genuine sense of power here, architectonic power. An old picture of the same church. On the other hand, I have to say, it happens that I know a little bit about this. There are many churches in the United States. I mentioned this before, just in Brooklyn, New York, I didn't count them, but I read that there are 11,000 churches. And I live myself on a street which on one side of the street at the intersection, there was a little church in every corner. So at one intersection, there were 4 churches. Not large, but kind of in this spirit, you know, from the 19th century, and well built, small churches, but each one different. I like this church. And the interior is also interesting, you know, with the structure apparent. I don't know about the colors. Maybe they changed over time. It's possible. So again, I don't think it is an accident or an error that he is in the company of Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, considered part of the trinity of North American architecture. No, he deserves it. Now, the one that we already saw a picture of, Trinity Church in Boston, it's a National Historic Landmark from 1872. At that time, Frank Lloyd Wright was already born. Sullivan was approaching his 20s. So this is the church in Boston, and as I said, this building is on the cover of the volume on modern architecture that Manfredo Tafuri and Francesco Dalco wrote. And you would say, isn't this surprising? You know, that volume was written by two very well-informed critics and theoreticians about the phenomenon called modern architecture. What's so modern about this building? I think they would have been better able than me to say it. But this building, although it appears to be historicist, it does have, you know, unconventionality. It's not, I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about historical styles and so on, but this facade of the building, although it appears to be, you know, oriented towards the past, is I feel it in its hybridity. There is a certain level of modernity, and we are dealing here with. So when was it built? In 1872. Um, it was, yes, it was a beginning. It was early. What buildings around that time in Europe claimed to be, you know, the initiators of modernity? It's maybe a question worth asking. The interior is also striking, you know. Could we call it modern? I don't know, but it is a very interesting interior, you know, colorful, and there is a richness here that cannot be denied. It's also almost something, you know, Russian here, if I can venture to say something like this. And you can see it's quite large because you see the silhouettes, the human silhouettes. This is quite a big church. Interesting work. And it deserves more study, I think, and more attention to things that I am not aware of now, but I feel there is something to learn from this building. Somehow it reminds me of the first building, if I'm not mistaken, by Otto Wagner, which was actually a synagogue in Budapest. His very first work. And, you know, there are buildings that we don't talk about, but they have the seeds of future developments within, and they are very interesting. This one also is very interesting, but this one is already considered a masterpiece, and you saw its status, uh, not just for Manfredo Tafuri and Francesco Dalco. There are innovations here. It's clear. It appears to belong to the so-called past, but it also announces something. You know, even the chromatics and the way the structure is I think is a remarkable building. 1872, Boston, H. Richardson. Even if some details, or maybe many so-called details, are borrowed from other historical examples, the way he combines them is unique. Now, a house from Rhode Island, 1874. This building also is good. You know, it's a domestic building. It's a large building, and it is very different from the church we just saw. But it has variety. That the articulation of the volumes, I think, is interesting, and this is, you know, how it looked, and this is how it looks now. It's difficult because some of these buildings receive some interventions, and it's difficult to know exactly how it looked like when it was built. Is this architecture inferior to, let's say, some works by Frank Lloyd Wright? Yes, Frank Lloyd Wright was more of an innovator, but there are qualities here that are not to be ignored. That's for sure. And I know at least one building in Oak Park by Frank Lloyd Wright where the sloping roof is somehow similar with what we see here. Uh, Again, we have to consider the fact that this man preceded both Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. So, you know, he couldn't be, I mean, he was more distant from what we call modernity than both Wright and Sullivan. Another building from Boston, this one, you know, an urban building. I don't know if it was for offices or for apartments. Hartford, Connecticut, 1875, a big building. The Romanesque, you know, arch is there. A certain level of ornamentation is there. The material is evoking, if not a reverence, but at least a submission to what we call gravity. It, again, what a difference from today. Almost any so-called interesting building is cantilevered. And the question is why? One answer would be because we can. We can deliver because we can use, you know, steel structures. But the question is, why do we need to cantilever so much? I have seen a project by a student at the university here in Bucharest who cantilevered for about 12, 15 meters in Bucharest, which is, as we know, a city that should know better considering the earthquakes. Richardson didn't have a desire for cantilever parts. And even Frank Lloyd Wright, he used the cantilever terraces at the falling water, it's true. But, you know, and yes, sometimes he has so-called flying roofs, but that's about it. You know, he doesn't have large portions of the building, you know, ready to take off towards Mars or towards the moon together with Mr. Elon Musk. I personally like gravity. You know, I used to say, and I continue to say, it's my only certitude, gravity. What would I do without it? Now, the New York State Capitol in Albany, 1875, another big civic building that this still young man built. He was probably around 40 at the most. He died at 46, 47. At 47, he died. Now, this might not be a very innovative building, but you know, to erect such a building is not such a little thing. Here I'm a little bit confused because it seems it is like this now, but unless it's a different, no, this is the same size, the same, something is wrong here. Is this the same side of the building? Because here I see the large steps towards the entrance, and here I don't see them. There is a change between what we see here and what we see here. Here there are 5 arches, and here there are only 3. But anyway, the building stands up, and the interior is as it is the same man who did the Trinity Church in Boston. And this is also, I would say, a remarkable interior and even a pleasant interior. Although it is historicist, and look at the picture that is older. Since we like space so much, well, this one does have a generous and inspiring space. It's in Albany, which is the capital of the state of New York. The Montgomery Memorial from 1876, but I don't have pictures here. Now this is a memorial library from 1876. I hope I have pictures of the building. He built several libraries. This is one of them, and I would say is impressive. Is you know, I mean, really, I know we like very much the library in Seattle by Rem Koolhaas, but what is wrong with this library? Yes, it's not you know, strikingly original, maybe, but it's a building that invites you in, and perhaps reading a book in this building is not an unpleasant action. What is interesting is that in the United States, and I noticed this, somehow history, although it's a new country, no, rather new compared to Europe and so on, but strangely perhaps the older buildings, or maybe it's not so strange, the older buildings in the United States are more striking. I don't know if I can verbalize properly what I'm trying to say. Is somehow I became more aware of history, of a historical architecture in the States than in Europe. Maybe because they have less, it's possible, of what we call historical architecture. And then the buildings stand out because they are rather unique or rare. Another library, Northeastern Massachusetts, 1877. not too different from the previous one, but still, you know, this one and this one. What one thing that distinguishes Richardson from Sullivan and Wright, you know, just at the first sight, is his extensive use or usage of stone. A great interior. I hope I have a better picture now. This reminds me a little bit of a room with the same kind of ceiling at Oak Park in the house studio of Frank Lloyd Wright, which he built for himself with borrowed money from Louis Sullivan. Before Sullivan found out that Frank Lloyd Wright was kind of stealing his clients, which he did, and then he fired Frank Lloyd Wright, or should I say Frank Lloyd Wrong. So now this building in Cambridge, again, you know, if this man built just this building, and he would have claimed with legitimacy a certain role in American architecture. But we already saw a good number of buildings, and we'll continue to see some other buildings by him. So in essence, H.H. Richardson is the architect who emphasizes the strength of the building. These are buildings you can trust, so to speak. They don't let you down like the School of Architecture in Cincinnati by Peter Eisenman, which had to be totally refurbished 20 years after it was built. Now, this is a building that says, you know, says yes to gravity, says yes to certain convictions, says yes to you know, established values. Maybe it's not a Hamletian architecture. It doesn't show too many doubts, maybe, but maybe architecture is not supposed to show so too many doubts. I don't know. Although I did promote sometimes myself in the past such a theme as a doubting or an unstable architecture. Now, this town hall in Northeastern is a little similar to the previous library that we saw. His architecture is not organic in the sense in the sense of the word as used by Frank Lloyd Wright. Yet, because of the materials he uses, it has an organic quality. You know, who would deny the fact that stone is organic, is part of nature, or brick the same, since it comes from the earth. So in this sense, is also an organic architecture, even though the geometry itself is not explicitly advocating that kind of organicity that Frank Lloyd Wright advocated. But it is still a building that belongs to the earth, I would say, very much so. And wouldn't want to leave the earth. As some, you know, enlightened people of the present do. Why would they want to go to Mars? To me, is not totally easily to understand at all. We'll give up on gravity there, but what do we gain? And what's wrong with gravity, really? The rectory for Trinity Church, this one, I don't know if it still exists. Maybe it does. It does. This is typical of him, this kind of entrance, you know, with this big arch. Yes, it took a big man, so to speak, to build in this way. And he was indeed a big man. Not just, you know, physically, I would say. He was, in a way, larger than life himself, H. Richardson. Now, this monument from 1879 is kind of interesting. I mean, maybe more than just kind of, because it's so primal, so archaic, so archetypal. You know, it's beyond before history. You know, it's in a way it's amazing that it was built like this. I hear a noise. If you are so kind to turn off the microphone, thank you. Please be kind and turn off the microphone. There is a noise in the background, and I don't want to make too many mistakes in my presentation. Thank you. So, you know, I look at this pile of stones, and I wonder, you know, this has nothing to do with historical styles. Is an ahistorical building, and I wonder, you know, I mean, before we saw buildings where there were some connections between what we call Romanesque architecture and Richardson's architecture, but here there are no historical references. Really, it's really a very primal and Ur architecture, Ur architecture. If I am to use a German way of expressing myself, although I do not know German. But Ur comes from, you know, primordial, you know. I know that Goethe was searching in the Black Forest for the Ur plant, meaning the primordial, the first plant, the primordial plant, which he thought had a built-in duality within itself. And because of it, because of that dichotomic duality, all the other plants derive from that Ur plant. Here we have an Ur architecture or Ur architecture. You know, the volume zero of architecture, if I am to use the words of Louis Sullivan, of Louis Kahn, sorry. Interesting, interesting. It's not a big building, it's not, but somehow in its rejection of any kind of historicist elements is saying something very powerful, I would say. This is a gate lodge from 1880. Look at these stones. You know, these stones are, in my opinion, they are a little bit too obviously present in the mass of the walls, but it is a unique building exactly because of this. I remember when I lived in Brooklyn, New York, there was a building. I don't know if it was built by Richardson, but very similar to this. And I was always very you know, aware that that was an exceptional building. It had the walls just like this with big stones, you know, emerging from the body of the building in almost as if they wanted to leave the building, like here, you know. Now I'm trying to imagine those people who build this building and bringing the stones all the way up there. It can be done, but lots of stones, no, and they don't seem to be without a significant weight. Some of them. So there was a lot of physical effort here put into this building. A bridge from 1880. A fine bridge. It's not a very with a large span, but still is a nice build. Is a nice bridge, I think. The romantic H. Richardson, the one who loved stone, the one who loved gravity, the one who didn't want to leave the Earth, and didn't want to be on the same trip with Elon Musk to Mars. Stony Brook Gatehouse from 1880. This one maybe is a building without too much glory, but it was built by him. We are going to see also a few railway stations by him. Another public library from 1880 in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is a National Historic Landmark, which shows that if a building receives this status of a National Historic Landmark, that building means society appreciates it. Unfortunately, I don't know why I don't have a picture of this. I hope something is strange here. I apologize. I should have had. An old colony railroad station from Northeastern. He inspired himself, as we already read, from Japanese architecture, maybe the wooden architecture of Japan. This doesn't look to me as being too Japanese, but there is a certain eclecticism here and there. But all in all, I think he was able to handle various programs with distinctiveness which belonged to him, even if there were and there are some influences here and there. We already saw this detail. I mean, who would do something like this today, to carve a dragon, somewhere, when building a railway station or whatever other building. Now, at that time, when he did this, the railway stations were important, and so was the railway. But I can tell you, because I used the train in the United States, is one of the most obsolete forms of transportation, not just in the United States, but maybe in the context of other countries. It's actually amazing how a retrograde that the North American trains are today. Only the poorest people use the train, and they didn't invest in yes, there are some efforts now again from Elon Musk with his innovations, but the trains, for example, I took once the train from New York City to Chicago, and it took me 18 hours. And in fact, I continued the trip from New York to Denver, Colorado, and it took me 48 hours. It's very slow, the train in the United States. Yes, it has air conditioning and it's massive, it's big, but compared to the European trains, they are far, far, far behind. But at that time in the 19th century, when the country was supposed to, be connected, I mean, they didn't have yet, the T-Ford, the T-model car, by Ford. And so the train was extremely important, but not any longer. Maybe it will come back it will be again of interest. I hope, actually, because I like trains, and because it's a form of transportation which, doesn't pollute like the myriad of cars that invade the whole earth. Trains are also romantic, and the railway stations are romantic. Now you go and wait for someone in the train station, or either you accompany someone who takes the train, or you wait for someone who comes with the train. It's something, for me, it's something emotional. relating to a train station. The Memorial Library buildings from, I hope I have pictures. Yes, here it is. It's not bad. It's a good building, and you know, he built others. It's not just this building. I like this interior. Unfortunately, I don't know if I don't have a more recent picture, but even in this old picture, is remarkable interior, really. Even if you don't like so-called historical architecture, you cannot deny the ingenuity of the ceiling and you know the in general the atmosphere of this large space. Pittsburgh Episcopal Church, 1883. It's very primal, you know. It's simple, and that sense is modern. In Germany, they built some, I would say, there some remarkable churches after the Second World War. Well, before the Second World War as well, but also mid-century German. Referring to the 20th century, mid-century German churches are quite good, very interesting. I will prepare a presentation about the modern German churches. Look at this. Yes, the picture is not quite satisfying, but you can tell is an architectonic complex work. Somehow unexpectedly, because the exterior is rather simple, but inside there is a richness that surprises one. The counting buildings in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Look at this, you know. I mean, if this building was in London, or I don't know what city in Great Britain, or I don't know, in the Netherlands or Belgium, you know, they would have been considered extremely, extremely important. And this is, you know, this is a building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that if we didn't look at the works of Richardson, I myself would not have known this building. And it's not the smallest building in the world. So it is a county buildings, Allegheny county buildings, very, very, you know, impressive civic structures. And yesterday we talked about Olmsted, the great landscape architect, and I read that he collaborated with, even on this project, I don't know exactly, there isn't a lot of landscape here, maybe the courtyards or whatever. He collaborated a lot with Richardson and Olmsted. What a nice partnership. This is almost a medieval architecture, or actually better said, Romanesque architecture. It's powerful with thick walls, a lot of opacity, small windows. It's very atypical for even for the 19th century, but especially in the United States. I think Richardson had a certain affinity for European architecture. There were influences of European architecture, of course, because the whole of the 19th century was eclectic until the arrival on the scene of the rebellious Frank Lloyd Wright, and to a lesser extent, Louis Sullivan. Otherwise, architects were influenced. They studied, many of them in France, you know, so they were formed, you know, by the cultural milieu of Europe. Well, it seems, even the newlywed appreciate the architecture of H. Richardson. In Pittsburgh is the museum of Andy Warhol, and I visited it, and I was very surprised that in that museum, Andy Warhol, who is considered by many, including in Europe, um, as a genius, and a critic or a journalist even compare him to Prince Mushkin by Dostoevsky, and by extension even with Christ himself. Anyway, Christ himself, meaning actually Andy Warhol, sorry, but I only refer to what I read. Andy Warhol actually dedicated a whole room to money in the memorial house, well, it's actually the Warhol Museum, a whole room dedicated to money. And you wonder, this is supposed to be about an artist, no, not about money. Anyway, an impressive building by Richardson, no doubt. The fortress like, yes, and in this sense maybe to an extent anti-modern, but there is, after all, the infatuation almost with the SOS brutalismus that happened in the last years. It seems to show some kind of a nostalgia for a solid, robust architecture. And here we have a robust architecture. And some might say this is SOS brutalismus, is a brutalist architecture, although the term is used in connection with the concrete architecture that was built at a certain period in time in the 20th century. Here we have in the 19th century a form of architecture that could be analogous to what we call brutalist architecture. This is in Waltham, Massachusetts. It's a house. You see, the interior has a certain move in the direction of opening up the plan, and a certain freedom of there is it's a dynamic interior. It's not static, and so there are modern elements in the architecture of H. Richardson. Another railroad station. I mean, these men obviously built a few buildings every year, because he has at least 40 buildings, and some of them quite large. And he actually practiced architecture for at the most 20 years. He died at 47. Well, around 20 years. So at least 2, 3 buildings a year, but some of them, as you saw, very, very large. Another church. Um, And I imagine at that time, the construction process took longer than now. I mean, just to carry those huge stones, you know, up the stairs, or I don't know, I'm joking, but this is not a building you build in 1 month. And certainly it was not like this in the 19th century. And he's rather unique because many churches actually in the United States are kind of like this on the right, you know, with whitish and light in spirit and not heavy. Richardson is heavy, is dark. And I'm thinking now of a song by Leonard Cohen just before he died. I like the way he pronounced the word dark. It's getting dark. I forgot exactly the words, but I remember, you know, the heaviness of the stone of the song. And here is the heaviness of the building. This very heaviness explicits in a way the relationship between Romanesque architecture and Richardson's architecture. Another library, 1885. They can be a little bit confusing because they are somehow similar, these libraries that he built, but they are different buildings. He built 4, 5, 6 libraries. And at least as many churches. And this heavy man, you know, also indulged in, I would say, sweet decorations here. You know, it shows that he had a gentle soul, that this work here shows sensitivity, you know, almost tenderness. And it moves me to see this. So it's not just, you know, heavy stone placed, you know, kind of brutally on the wall. No, there is also embroidery here, gentleness. Hello, how are you today? You don't seem to be very happy. What kind of an animal are you anyway? Because it's not very obvious to me. You are obviously a mythological animal, are you not? You are winged, but you are also an animal. Um, you don't seem to be very happy. You probably know that tomorrow I will talk about architecture and disgust, and even dissent. And your face seems to express something like this somehow. I'll think about it. I hope I don't dream of you tonight. Memorial Fountain in Detroit. This is whitish, indeed. This is America. America likes things that are not excessively heavy, you know. And this one is maybe heavy, but because of the whiteness, is light in spirit, so to speak. I don't like this one too much, but I like it more when it was like this in the old times. By the way of this, I really don't think the cathedrals were ever white, whatever, and I said this before, whatever Le Corbusier said. He wrote a book when the cathedrals were white, and I don't think they were white because stone is generally not white, you know, it's rather grayish. So I think the cathedrals were never purely white as Le Corbusier wanted them to be, I think. Anyway, even here, you know, look how the building was in earlier times and look how it is now. So it became white, but it was not white at the beginning, no. Another house, National Historic Landmark, quite a big house. It's a citadel almost, with a courtyard. We saw already a picture of this. Isn't it rather strange to see those cars in front of this building, which could have been, you know, I don't know from what century, but the building itself seems to be, you know, connected with times when the car did not exist. This is a national landmark as well. I don't know. I like other buildings by him more than this one, but that's irrelevant actually. Although this portion of the building is nice, I think. And I think also Richardson uses a better material for the sloping roofs than Frank Lloyd Wright. I always felt that the buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright had this deficiency. He, well, maybe I think so because I grew up in Sibiu where there are the sloping roofs, have ceramic tiles, ziegler, and you know, in the United States, they have other materials, and very rarely you come across a roofing like here, which is convincing from this point of view. Somehow, I have a feeling that such a roof should be kind of reddish, you know, Zieglerless and Roshi. Here, I think Richardson is closer to a what I call, between quotation marks, a true sloping roof than in the case of Wright. This is my perception and my opinion. Union Passenger Station in New London, Connecticut, another, this one, a bigger railway station. Yes, the 19th century was in love with the train and with the train stations. And I wish I could say the same thing now, but now in the 20th century and in the 21st, the train mode of transportation was sabotaged by the big manufacturers of cars. They didn't want a competition for the cars. So there were no investments in train stations and in trains. All the investments went into the production of cars, cars, and cars again. But the train doesn't kill the city, the car does. This is the house that I mentioned was built in England, a very nice house, and it's bad it was destroyed. So Lulu Lounge was a Romanesque revival style house and studio of German-born British artist Hubert von Herkomer in Melbourne Road, Hertfordshire in Great Britain. It was designed in around 1886 and inhabited in 1894. It was demolished, unfortunately, in 1939. The exterior design was developed from a sketch by the American architect Henry Hobson Richardson, so the architect we talk about today, H. Richardson, and was the only example of his work in Europe. And I think it was an excellent building. Now, maybe it wasn't entirely his, because from what we read, it was just based on a sketch he did. But nevertheless, if it is considered the building, the only building by him in Europe, his input was probably important. And it's a very fine building. Unfortunately, what was demolished. And I hope I have here a fragment of the one that is still alive. Here it is. From this building, we get this. Why would such a building be demolished? I don't know, because it was demolished before the Second World War. So it was not destroyed by the war. Anyway, this is the remnant. An otherwise excellent building. Another house in Newton, Massachusetts, quite large, this one as well. And we see again this kind of house with a courtyard, an inner courtyard, an enclosed courtyard, which is kind of interesting. We are approaching the end of this presentation on H. Richardson. This is also an interesting house because that courtyard shows that, in my opinion, that Richardson also had disponibilities towards introversion, and that this is not typical for North America. North America advocates rather extroversion. not introversion, but if we look at the building here from the top, this somehow shows that there is an inner life of the building. And this is not quite a typical North American building now. I like it. It's a large building, but it is somehow fragmented in the proper way, and it's not overwhelming. And I like the horizontality of the building and the verticality of the trees, and it's a nice dialectic, I think. And when the trees are green and the redness of the building, again, it's some kind of a, conjunctio oppositorum. And so I think it's a good building. Thank you very much. And yes, he died, and I'm sorry he died only at 47. But what can we do? Life